Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. This request is not incidental. It establishes position, locality, and temporal awareness, three elements that matter when discussing a figure whose influence is defined by deep time and submerged continuity. Dagon enters modern culture through H.P. Lovecraft's 1919 short story, yet the name carries older sediment. Near Eastern religion, biblical polemic, and 19th century oceanic science all press against the text. What emerges is not a character in the conventional sense, but a problem. Dagon resists motive, doctrine, and narrative closure. We must pause here to clarify the scope of this investigation. This documentary does not ask what Dagon is in a zoological or theological sense. It asks what Dagon wants from modern civilization, a question that only makes sense if want is understood metaphorically, and civilization is understood as temporary. Lovecraft wrote during a period marked by World War I, rapid industrialization, and new awareness of geological and evolutionary time. His fiction absorbs these pressures, translating them into oceanic metaphors that refuse moral alignment. Our approach will move deliberately between literary analysis, historical context, and cultural afterlife. Consider this carefully. Dagon functions less like a god issuing commands, and more like an index of truths civilization struggles to suppress. Comparisons will be drawn to later works, such as The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, as well as to older traditions of seaborne wisdom figures, from Owans to Proteus. By continuing, participation occurs. Attention itself becomes a form of acknowledgement. This is not immersion, but implication. The investigation proceeds from there. H.P. Lovecraft wrote Dagon in 1919, shortly after returning from a period of nervous collapse and intellectual reorientation. The First World War had concluded, but its conceptual aftermath lingered. Industrialized slaughter, mechanized scale, and the collapse of 19th century progress narratives formed the background conditions of the story. Lovecraft's correspondence from this period reveals a growing preoccupation with humanity's fragility when measured against geological and cosmic time. Dagon emerges from this context as a compressed experiment. It is not a polished mythos entry, but a test case. The text probes whether terror can be generated without villains, moral struggle, or resolution. Lovecraft's creator intent here was exploratory rather than systematic. He had not yet articulated the full architecture of what would later be called the Cthulhu Mythos. Instead, he was experimenting with scale, documentation, and epistemic shock. The story adopts the voice of a rational observer, educated, restrained, precise, whose authority collapses under a single encounter. This choice reflects Lovecraft's own anxieties about modern knowledge systems. Scientific progress promised mastery, yet the war demonstrated how knowledge could amplify destruction. Dagon stages this contradiction by presenting discovery as destabilization rather than enlightenment. Consider this carefully. The sea is not a setting chosen for atmosphere alone. By 1919, oceanography had begun mapping depths previously imagined as bottomless. Submarine warfare had turned the ocean into a strategic weapon. Lovecraft follows contemporary scientific writing closely, and the story's fixation on pressure, depth, and biological otherness mirrors late 19th century natural history texts. This is not maritime adventure, but anti-exploration. The narrator does not conquer a new space. He survives contact with it. The implication is clear. Knowledge expands faster than the human mind's capacity to integrate it. Lovecraft's personal philosophy further sharpens this intent. He rejected anthropocentrism outright, influenced by materialist thinkers and by the emerging implications of Darwinian evolution. Humanity, in his view, was not the culmination of history, but a brief configuration of matter. Dagon embodies this conviction. The entity is not hostile in a conventional sense, nor benevolent. It simply exists within a temporal scale that renders human categories irrelevant. Not a demon demanding allegiance, but an index of pre-human continuity. This distinction matters because it reframes horror as ontological displacement rather than moral threat. We must pause here to address Lovecraft's psychological investments. His documented revulsion toward biological hybridity, degeneration theory, and miscegenation undeniably inform the imagery of Dagon. These elements cannot be excised from analysis. Yet reducing the story to personal pathology misses its broader function. The fear articulated is not only social, but temporal. The horror lies in the suggestion that civilization rests on an exposed surface, layer beneath which older systems persist. This reveals something profound. The anxiety is not invasion, but inheritance. Comparisons help clarify this intent. Unlike Poe's tales of psychological unraveling, which turn inward, Dagon turns outward toward scale. Unlike Wells's scientific romances, which retain human problem-solving frameworks, Lovecraft removes the possibility of response altogether. The story aligns more closely with late Romantic ruin literature, yet replaces nostalgia with indifference. The triad here is instructive. Documentation, discovery, dissolution. Each step follows logically, leaving no space for heroism. What then did Lovecraft intend Dagon to represent in 1919? Not a god in the theological sense, but a corrective. Not a monster to be defeated, but a presence that invalidates human centrality. According to Lovecraft's later reflections, the goal was to suggest a malignly neutral universe. The phrase is telling. Malign, not because it hates us, but because it does not recognize us. This subsection establishes the conditions under which Dagon first surfaces: a post-war world, an expanding scientific horizon, and a writer testing the limits of horror as philosophy. With this groundwork laid, we turn next to the deeper cultural and philosophical currents Lovecraft draws upon, many of which predate him by millennia. The name Dagon did not originate with Lovecraft, and this fact is central rather than incidental. Long before 1919, Dagon appears in ancient Near Eastern records associated with the Philistines, most prominently in texts dated between roughly 1200 and 600 BCE. Scholarly debate persists over whether this Dagon was a grain deity, a fish deity, or a later conflation produced by linguistic drift and polemical rewriting. What matters for Lovecraft's usage is not theological accuracy, but instability. The name arrives already fractured, carrying incompatible meanings that resist harmonization. This instability becomes a feature, not a flaw. Biblical accounts further complicate the figure. In the Book of Samuel, Dagon's idol collapses before the Ark of the Covenant, its head and hands severed. The passage functions as religious propaganda, asserting the superiority of Yahweh over rival gods. Lovecraft inverts this logic. His Dagon is not humiliated by contact with a newer deity. Instead, modern civilization occupies the vulnerable position, exposed and structurally unsound. The cultural memory of defeated gods thus becomes, in Lovecraft's hands, a warning about the fragility of historical dominance. We must pause here to consider the classical tradition. Greek and Roman literature repeatedly associates the sea with ancient, mutable knowledge. Figures such as Proteus and Triton embody truth that resists direct access, requiring coercion or transformation to extract. Unlike Olympian gods, these beings precede stable mythic order. Lovecraft inherits this association, but removes the transactional framework. There is no bargain to be struck with Dagon, no riddle to solve. The sea retains knowledge, but it no longer communicates on human terms. 19th century science adds another critical layer. Advances in geology and evolutionary biology radically expanded humanity's sense of time. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, 1830-1833, and Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, displaced biblical chronologies with deep, impersonal processes. Lovecraft absorbed these implications fully. The ocean, newly understood as a product of aeons rather than mythic chaos, becomes a logical repository for pre-human life. Dagon emerges at the intersection of myth and science, where ancient gods resemble extinct or extant biological orders. Consider this carefully. The terror here is not superstition returning, but superstition reclassified as premature science. What earlier cultures framed as divine may represent accurate, if poorly articulated, encounters with non-human realities. This idea appears across comparative mythology, from Mesopotamian Apkallu figures to Polynesian sea ancestors. Lovecraft's contribution is to strip these traditions of symbolic reassurance. The continuity remains, but meaning does not. Knowledge persists without guidance, memory without intention, existence without audience. Philosophically, this aligns with emerging currents of cosmic pessimism and materialism. Thinkers such as Arthur Schopenhauer and, later, early 20th century scientific naturalists rejected teleological explanations of existence. The universe does not unfold toward human flourishing. It unfolds, period. Lovecraft translates this position into narrative form. Dagon is not evil, not punitive, not corrective, not a moral agent, but a remainder. This distinction clarifies why attempts to moralize the mythos consistently fail. Comparisons sharpen the contrast. Where Christian demonology externalizes threat as moral opposition, Lovecraftian entities dissolve the moral axis entirely. Where Norse myth frames ancient giants as enemies defeated to establish order, Lovecraft implies the giants were never defeated, only ignored. The triadic pattern here is instructive: displacement, reinterpretation, return. Each stage corresponds to a cultural shift in how humanity understands its place in the cosmos. By drawing from fractured theology, classical sea lore, and modern science simultaneously, Lovecraft constructs Dagon as a convergence point rather than an invention ex nihilo. The figure feels ancient because it is assembled from materials already saturated with temporal depth. This layered inheritance prepares the ground for the next problem: how language itself struggles to contain such convergence. That challenge leads directly into the question of etymology and symbolic expression, where meaning begins to fail under its own weight. The etymology of Dagon is unstable by design. In ancient Semitic languages, the root dgn oscillates between meanings. In some interpretations, it connects to grain, Dagon in Hebrew, while in others, to fish, dag. This semantic ambiguity became a tool for later writers, especially in polemical contexts. By the time Lovecraft encounters the name, it has already accrued centuries of theological confusion and linguistic drift. This instability proves useful. A term that cannot be pinned down semantically mirrors the kind of unknowability Lovecraft cultivates in his cosmic figures. The biblical conflation of Dagon with fish imagery likely results from phonetic overlap and cultural projection. Philistine religious practices remain obscure, but but the Hebrew authors of the Old Testament depict Dagon through a lens of mockery. Lovecraft inverts this intention. He accepts the fish god misreading not as error, but as symptom. What we now call Dagon may never have referred to a discrete entity. Instead, the name collects distortions over time, each reflecting human attempts to render the sea intelligible. This recursive distortion becomes the essence of Dagon, not a single god, but a linguistic sinkhole. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's use of language in Dagon avoids specificity even as it implies precision. The narrator describes reliefs, monoliths, and impossible beings in the language of science and cartography, yet none of the terms resolve. Cyclopean, bas-relief, non-Euclidean. Each term implies technical accuracy, while simultaneously signaling failure. This rhetorical strategy destabilizes the reader's relationship with descriptive language itself. Words no longer point to stable reference. They spiral into approximation. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's symbolic system. He does not use metaphor to explain the unknown. He uses it to contain the collapse of explanation. Fish-human hybrids, sunken ruins, and impossible angles function not as symbols of specific fears, but as residues of semantic failure. The human mind, encountering pre-human reality, attempts to speak, but only distortions emerge. In this light, Dagon is not merely a being, but a symptom of linguistic breakdown. The ocean reinforces this. In Lovecraft's work, the sea is not just a setting, but a medium that resists articulation. It swallows language. Sound behaves differently underwater. Symbols erode. Maps fail. Entities like Dagon arise from this semantic disintegration. Even the narrator's attempt to describe the creature collapses into metaphor. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares. This phrase is notable not for what it says, but for what it fails to say. The simile, like a monster of nightmares, replaces observation with evasion. Language retreats as terror advances. Other writers have noted similar dynamics. In Borges's The Library of Babel, language becomes infinite and meaningless. In Kafka, language obscures rather than reveals. Lovecraft's contribution is to bind this dynamic to physical space. The sea in his fiction is not metaphorical. It is the literal zone where meaning dissolves. The triad here is clear: depth, distortion, disarticulation. As one descends, clarity does not increase. It fractures. This strategy places Lovecraft in contrast with mythographers who treat etymology as a source of revelation. In the mythos, etymology obscures. Dagon does not gain definition through linguistic analysis. It gains ambiguity. This is not accidental. It aligns with Lovecraft's broader strategy of withholding. The reader is led to believe that more precise knowledge lies just outside the frame, but that knowledge never materializes. Instead, we are left with fragments of language that hint, but never define. Having traced the semantic instability and symbolic breakdown surrounding Dagon's name and its representations, we now shift focus to how Lovecraft uses narrative form to simulate authenticity while preserving ambiguity. Myth building in. His work does not offer coherence, but the illusion of coherence. This is the domain of documents, confessions, and arcane citations, where structure itself becomes part of the horror. Lovecraft's horror derives power not from explicit description, but from the illusion that the story is merely one account among many. In Dagon, this technique is embryonic, but already deliberate. The narrator speaks in the first person, framing the tale as a confessional document. He offers no name, no clear date, no geographical coordinates, only fragments. These omissions are not oversights, they are structural devices. By withholding conventional markers of narrative fiction, Lovecraft mimics the tone of a discovered manuscript or a suppressed report. The story gains plausibility precisely through its refusal to behave like a story. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's myth-building. Rather than creating a single cohesive cosmology, he develops an archive, a collection of inconsistent, damaged, or partial perspectives. The method draws more from historical forgeries and antiquarian scholarship than from epic literature. Each text hints at connections, but those connections remain unconfirmed. Dagon references reliefs, rituals, and ancient beings, but provides no sourcebook. This absence generates authenticity through suggestion. We are not told that the narrator is unreliable. We feel it because his knowledge is fragmentary, and his fear disproportionate. Triadic patterning recurs here. Lovecraft frequently groups narrative elements in threes: the monolith, the creature, the dream, the shipwreck, the drift, the encounter. These clusters imply ritual significance without stating it. The technique echoes the structure of myth, but the meaning is removed. What remains is form without function, ceremonial fragments in a secular register. This emptiness is unsettling because it invites projection. Readers supply their own connective tissue, making the horror more personal, more participatory. Unlike Tolkien's legendarium, which builds coherence through linguistic depth and invented history, Lovecraft constructs his mythos through absence, contradiction, and deferral. His world is not enriched by lore, but hollowed out by implication. References to forbidden books, like the Necronomicon, obscure cults, and pre-human civilizations recur across his stories, but they do not stabilize the mythology, they multiply it. Dagon's appearance in one tale is never fully explained in another. This discontinuity is intentional. It mirrors the way ancient myths survive, incomplete, contradictory, and refracted through unreliable transmission. Scholars have noted how Lovecraft borrows from the visual rhetoric of archaeology. Descriptions of artifacts, weathered stone, eroded inscriptions, monstrous carvings, simulate the experience of piecing together a lost history. But these details function as traps. They offer the promise of discovery without resolution. The deeper the investigation, the more disjointed the fragments become. Knowledge does not accumulate, it disintegrates. This mechanism mimics real-world pseudo-history, where coherence is manufactured through selective citation and speculative leaps. Lovecraft critiques this impulse even as he exploits it. The narrative voice in Dagon contributes further to this effect. The narrator insists on his sanity, positions himself as rational, and recounts events with the precision of a field report. But these markers are not stabilizing. They are symptoms. The more clinical the language, the more obvious the rupture. In the absence of external confirmation, the story becomes a closed circuit, a document written by someone whose mind was altered by what he saw, or believes he saw. Lovecraft leaves this question open because the ambiguity is the point. The horror resides not in whether Dagon is real, but in the narrator's inability to contain what happened within his epistemic framework. In sum, Lovecraft's myth-building depends on simulation, of scholarly form, of documentary voice, of intertextual depth. But these are simulations without resolution. The effect is cumulative. Each tale implies more than it reveals. Each detail hints at a submerged order that cannot be diagrammed. And this is precisely the function of Dagon within the larger mythos. Not a central deity, but an aperture, a sign that something vast, indifferent, and layered beneath time occasionally surfaces. Not to deliver a message, but to remind us that the archive is incomplete and always will be. We now move from the narrative scaffolding that lends the Dagon myth its credibility to the thematic and conceptual core that gives it lasting power. The next section examines what Dagon means, not in doctrinal terms, but in philosophical ones. What does it represent? What system of thought allows such an entity to exist? And why does that system so often reduce human minds to madness? Lovecraftian horror rests on three interlocking philosophical principles: insignificance, entropy, and dream reality instability. These are not thematic flourishes, but ontological arguments. Dagon, as depicted in the 1919 story and later mythos expansions, embodies these principles in narrative form. Unlike classical horror rooted in evil or transgression, cosmic horror suggests the universe is not hostile, but indifferent. Dagon is not a villain. Dagon is a consequence. Once this is grasped, the story ceases to be a monster tale and becomes something more unsettling, a parable about the limits of meaning. Begin with insignificance. The narrator in Dagon confronts a landscape that dwarfs him in both space and time. The island that rises from the sea is described as of such vast extent that I could not see its full contours, and carved with images of beings which I dared not describe. These observations mark the collapse of anthropocentric perspective. The narrator's terror stems not from violence, but from irrelevance. He is not targeted, he is overlooked. Dagon does not pursue him, threaten him, or speak to him. Its appearance suggests a world where humanity is neither central nor exceptional. This philosophical stance resonates with the materialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Darwin, Lyell, and Huxley destabilized religious cosmologies by showing that human beings were products of chance and process, not design. Lovecraft deepens this destabilization by suggesting that consciousness itself is fragile. To realize one species is not central is disturbing. To realize that reality itself may not be stable is worse. Dagon's environment, shifting geology, dreamlike chronology, impossible architecture, refuses to confirm the narrator's perceptions. He cannot be sure what he saw, and yet he is destroyed by it. Here entropy becomes essential. Lovecraft's universe does not move toward progress or restoration. It moves toward dissolution. Civilization is framed as a brief anomaly, a sandbar between aeons. The ancient monolith Dagon emerges beside is not just old, it is pre-human. The story implies this structure has been submerged for geological time, waiting. Its reemergence suggests cycles far older than human history. As the narrator says, "I believe I went mad then." This madness is not personal weakness, but cognitive entropy, the collapse of structures that allow experience to be categorized. The implication is clear. Dagon does not come to destroy civilization. Civilization is already decaying. Dagon merely surfaces when the veneer peels back. Entropy is not caused by the creature. It is merely revealed. This aligns with broader Lovecraftian metaphysics, in which all order is temporary, and all knowledge tends toward destabilization. In this sense, Dagon functions like Nietzsche's abyss. To gaze upon it is not to gain power, but to lose structure. Now we must consider dream reality instability. The story ends ambiguously. Was the island real or a hallucination? Did the narrator escape a genuine encounter, or did he hallucinate everything during his time adrift? Lovecraft does not resolve the question because resolution would reduce the horror. What matters is that the narrator cannot tell the difference. This epistemic instability, the inability to trust one's senses, memories, or categories, is central to the cosmic horror tradition. Dreams in Lovecraft are not internal states, they are leaks. Realities bleed through them. This dynamic becomes more explicit in later works like The Call of Cthulhu and The Shadow Out of Time, but Dagon initiates the pattern. The narrator dreams of monstrous beings, then sees one, or he sees one, then dreams of it. The order is unclear, the boundary unstable. Lovecraft collapses Cartesian distinctions between mind and world. If perception cannot be trusted and reality does not correspond to human frameworks, then knowledge becomes paralysis, not empowerment, but vertigo. Triadic structures help reinforce this collapse. Consider dream, encounter, madness, or discovery, dread, dissolution. These recurring sequences simulate inevitability. Once the process begins, it cannot be reversed. This is not a morality tale in which error leads to consequence. It is a cosmological algorithm triggered by exposure. Dagon is not an antagonist. Dagon is a phase change. In conclusion, the story's horror arises not from malice, but from the reader's gradual realization that scale, time, and perception are misaligned with human faculties. Dagon is a vehicle for this realization. The concepts of insignificance, entropy, and dream reality bleed are not background themes. They are the architecture of the experience. In the next section, we explore the forces that inhabit this architecture more fully. Entities, not as characters, but as ontological statements in monstrous form. In Lovecraft's cosmology, entities like Dagon do not merely populate the world, they constitute its hidden architecture. Unlike mythological pantheons with clear hierarchies, roles, and interpersonal drama, the figures of the Cthulhu Mythos resist systematization. Dagon, in particular, appears marginal yet essential, not a god in the transcendent sense, nor a demon in the Christian tradition, but a presence embedded in ecological, evolutionary, and temporal strata. To ask what Dagon is, or where he fits, is to adopt categories the mythos deliberately undermines. In Dagon, the entity is unnamed within the story itself, referred to by readers through later attribution. It is described only as a stupendous monster of nightmares, rising beside a monolith carved with aquatic humanoids. This being does not speak, explain, or demand. It simply appears, then returns to the sea. Its function is not narrative advancement, but ontological destabilization. Later mythos texts, particularly The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, retroactively associate Dagon with the Deep Ones, amphibious, immortal beings who form pacts with coastal humans in exchange for wealth and interbreeding. Yet even in these expansions, Dagon remains ambiguous. Is he their god, their king, their priest? No definitive answer is offered. This ambiguity is strategic. Lovecraft constructs his entities not as characters, but as forces, ontological statements rendered monstrous. Cthulhu represents psychic latency and non-Euclidean geometry. Azathoth embodies chaos and blind entropy. Yog-Sothoth signifies the collapse of linear time. Dagon, by contrast, embodies biological continuity, the horror that human life is neither unique nor stable, but one temporary permutation in a much older process. He is less a deity than a reminder, a signal from the past, or from beneath, that evolution did not end with us. The deep ones support this reading. Unlike many of Lovecraft's entities, they are not alien or incorporeal. They are tangible, fecund, and embedded in human genealogies. The horror of Innsmouth lies not in being killed by them, but in becoming them. This introduces a rare instance of intimacy in Lovecraft's fiction, albeit intimacy as contamination. The deep ones do not invade, they return, they reclaim. Dagon, positioned above them in cultic terms, becomes a symbol of what lies at the end of this regression. Not death, but absorption into something older and oceanic. We must pause here to consider the Dreamlands, Lovecraft's parallel reality accessed through dreams. Though largely explored in other stories, such as The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the Dreamlands concept feeds back into the Dagon myth. The protagonist of Dagon experiences dreams of strange architecture and aquatic worship long before consciously encountering the creature. This suggests that entities like Dagon exist across boundaries of mind and matter, time, and sleep. They are not confined to physical locations. They seep. Through dreams, they foreshadow their presence and infiltrate consciousness, destabilizing perception before manifesting physically. The theological implications are deliberately murky. Dagon has worshippers, both in ancient times and in Innsmouth, but whether he wants this is unclear. Unlike Abrahamic deities, who seek obedience or devotion, Lovecraft's entities rarely acknowledge worship. In some stories, cultic rituals provoke response. In others, they are ignored entirely. The suggestion is that these rituals are misinterpretations, anthropomorphic frameworks imposed on indifferent forces. Dagon's presence may have inspired mythology, but he does not need mythology. He existed before language, before belief, and his existence continues regardless. This aligns with the broader structure of the mythos. Entities are not personifications of ideas. They are the ideas, with all their alien implications intact. Lovecraft's monsters do not teach lessons. They reveal conditions. Dagon is not an antagonist to humanity. He is prior to it. His presence suggests that the deep ones, and by extension humanity, are part of the same biological continuum. The horror lies not in their otherness, but in our proximity to them. The triadic structure of mythos ontology helps clarify this. There are entities, like Cthulhu, there are intermediaries, like Nyarlathotep, and there are survivals or offshoots, like the deep ones. Dagon occupies a liminal space, possibly an ancient intermediary, possibly a high-ranking survival. This refusal to classify is not a flaw, but a feature. It reflects the epistemic collapse that defines the mythos. The closer we come to understanding, the less we comprehend. Having now explored the nature of Dagon and his kin, we next turn to the human cost of such proximity. What happens to those who encounter these beings? What does madness mean in this context, and why is it inevitable? The answers, such as they are, lie in the psychology of contact, with entities that neither hate nor love, but endure. In Lovecraft's fiction, madness is not a moral failure or a narrative punishment. It is a diagnostic outcome. When human cognition encounters realities structured beyond its evolved parameters, psychological collapse follows with mechanical consistency. The narrator of Dagon does not sin, transgress, or seek forbidden rites. He survives a shipwreck, observes an anomalous landscape, and records what he sees. This is sufficient. Madness arises not from curiosity, but from exposure. The story thus reframes insanity as a measurement, evidence that the mind has exceeded its tolerances. This interpretation aligns with early 20th century anxieties about psychology itself. Freud's interpretation of dreams appeared in 1889, and by the 1910s, the unconscious had become a destabilizing concept. The mind was no longer a transparent instrument of reason, but a layered, fragile system prone to breakdown. Lovecraft absorbs this shift while rejecting its therapeutic optimism. There is no cure in Dagon. The narrator's symptoms, obsession, paranoia, recurrent dreams, suicidal ideation, do not indicate trauma in the modern sense. They indicate contact with an incompatible reality. The mind fails because it functions correctly. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft's protagonists rarely go mad immediately. The process unfolds in stages. First comes rationalization, then doubt, then fixation. The narrator insists on the material reality of what he saw, even as he fears its implications. He researches, cross-references, and dreams. Madness here is not the loss of reason, but its overextension. Reason attempts to assimilate data it was never meant to process. The result is not ignorance, but cognitive overload. This pattern recurs throughout the mythos. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, artists and scholars suffer shared dreams that fracture their sense of individuality. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, trained scientists meticulously document their discoveries, even as those discoveries invalidate the scientific worldview that enabled them. Madness follows not because these characters abandon rationality, but because rationality proves insufficient. The triad is consistent: encounter, interpretation, collapse. Dagon intensifies this dynamic by refusing interaction. The creature does not acknowledge the narrator. There is no dialogue, no threat, no pursuit. This absence is critical. Madness is not caused by violence or terror alone, but by irrelevance. The narrator realizes that his presence does not matter. He has witnessed something vast, ancient, and autonomous. The human mind, evolved to interpret agency and intention, cannot accommodate phenomena that operate without either. This is not fear of death. It is fear of insignificance. We must pause here to address the social dimension of madness in Lovecraft's work. Characters who glimpse cosmic truths are isolated. They cannot communicate what they have learned without sounding delusional. In Dagon, the narrator explicitly fears being institutionalized. This reflects contemporary attitudes toward mental illness, but it also serves a structural purpose. Knowledge becomes non-transferable. Once acquired, it severs the knower from the community. Madness thus functions as a quarantine mechanism, preventing destabilizing truths from spreading unchecked. Not X, but Y becomes essential here. Madness is not the price of forbidden knowledge, but the evidence of its accuracy. The more coherent the experience, the more disruptive its implications. Lovecraft's characters are not unreliable because they are mad. They are mad because they are reliable witnesses to realities that negate human frameworks. This inversion distinguishes cosmic horror from gothic insanity, where madness often masks guilt or repression. Dreams play a mediating role in this process. They are not symbolic expressions of inner conflict, but channels of transmission. In Dagon, the narrator's dreams intensify after the encounter, suggesting a lingering connection. Later stories formalize this mechanism, portraying dreams as shared spaces where entities exert influence without physical presence. Madness emerges when the boundary between waking perception and dream knowledge dissolves. The mind loses its ability to compartmentalize. Everything becomes contiguous. The psychological cost of this collapse is permanent. There is no recovery arc in Lovecraft's universe. Those who know cannot unknow. Suicide, withdrawal, or transformation become the only available endpoints. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator ultimately embraces his fate, redefining madness as adaptation. This reveals the final function of madness in the mythos. It marks the threshold between human limitation and post-human continuity. As we move forward, this raises a deeper question. If madness results from knowledge that cannot be integrated, what happens when knowledge itself becomes unavoidable? When archives are opened, artifacts uncovered, and histories reconstructed, the next subsection examines this problem directly, turning from psychological consequences to epistemological collapse, where knowing too much erodes the very concept of knowledge. In Lovecraft's world, knowledge is not redemptive, it is corrosive. The Enlightenment ideal, which equates discovery with empowerment, is inverted. Forbidden knowledge does not liberate, it disassembles the structures that allow meaning to cohere. In Dagon, this collapse is quiet, almost clinical. The narrator does not stumble upon a ritual or recite incantations. He merely observes land, stone, creature. Yet this passive reception is sufficient to dismantle his cognitive and emotional framework. The encounter does not kill him. It renders him structurally incompatible with continued human life. This is not a metaphor for psychological trauma. It is a commentary on epistemic fragility. The idea that our understanding of reality rests on assumptions so deep, they are invisible until violated. In Dagon, these assumptions include stable geography, knowable biology, historical continuity, and the reliability of perception. The narrator's breakdown begins the moment the ocean floor becomes dry land. From that point onward, every observation subtracts from his conceptual coherence. The creature at the monolith merely finalizes the process. Epistemic collapse in the mythos often follows a triadic pattern: discovery, dissonance, disintegration. In the Dunwich Horror, the discovery of Wilbur Whately's lineage breaks the boundary between myth and biology. And at the Mountains of Madness, the deciphering of the Elder Things mural history collapses the temporal boundary between human and alien civilization. In Dagon, the process is condensed. The narrator's observations dismantle his world not through contradiction, but through scale. The world he thought he inhabited proves to be a thin membrane over something older and unbounded. We must pause here to consider the nature of the forbidden. In earlier literary traditions, forbidden knowledge is framed morally. Knowledge of good and evil, or of divine mysteries, transgressed by willful pride. Lovecraft strips this framework away. Forbidden knowledge is not proscribed because it is sacred. It is unbearable because it is true. The prohibition is not ethical, but neurological. Human cognition evolved under conditions that excluded this kind of awareness. To possess it is not to become enlightened. It is to be reclassified. This distinction is vital. The mythos does not punish curiosity. It punishes contact. Even unintentional observation incurs collapse. Dagon is seen only once, from a distance, without communication or confrontation. Yet the narrator's worldview cannot recover. This suggests that knowledge in the mythos is not a matter of quantity or context. It is ontologically viral. To glimpse the real structure of things is to inherit its corrosion. Lovecraft's fictional archives reflect this logic. The Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, and other grimoires are not powerful because they offer spells or incantations. Their danger lies in their frameworks. They map a cosmos in which human significance does not register. To read them is not to gain agency, but to lose existential orientation. Even their fragments are disruptive. In the nameless city, a single inscription, "That is not dead which can eternal lie," reorients the reader's temporal assumptions. Eternity is not a divine promise. It is a biological inevitability, indifferent to perception. Not X, but Y. Not secrets guarded by cults, but facts beyond utility. Not heresy, but irrelevance. This is the true horror of forbidden knowledge in the Mythos. It reveals not that we are mistaken about reality, but that our frameworks for reality are themselves parochial. Dagon is a local instance of this truth, a figure whose very existence unseats any claim to coherent cosmology. The ocean that conceals him is not mystical. It is unknowable by design, a space where human classification breaks down. Dreams again function as transitional zones. The narrator in Dagon dreams of ancient aquatic rituals before he fully processes what he saw. This suggests that forbidden knowledge does not enter solely through rational pathways. It leaks into subconscious structures, warping them from within. Once implanted, it cannot be dislodged. This is epistemic collapse as possession, not by spirits, but by frameworks incompatible with cognition. In conclusion, forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is not externalized as lore or spellcraft. It is internalized as decay, of language, of perception, of the conceptual boundary between world and mind. Dagon stands at the threshold of this decay, an entity whose mere appearance rewrites the rules of significance, time, and biological order. What remains is not enlightenment, but paralysis. In the next section, we turn to the literary aftermath of such ideas, how writers, including Lovecraft himself, expanded this framework through intertextuality, evolving Dagon from a solitary nightmare into a recurring signature of collapse. Dagon, 1919, is widely recognized as the first fully Lovecraftian story, though it lacks many formal elements of what would later become the Cthulhu Mythos. Still, it seeds foundational concepts: an indifferent universe, contact with a pre-human entity, and the obliteration of psychological and epistemological boundaries. At less than 2,000 words, it is structurally slight, but conceptually dense. It anticipates, rather than defines, the mythos. As such, it functions more like a pilot episode than a doctrinal text, containing the DNA of a much larger, later architecture. The story introduces motifs that recur throughout Lovecraft's corpus. The nameless narrator, adrift in an undefined oceanic location, stumbles upon a landmass thrown up by seismic upheaval. A slime-coated expanse of hellish black mire, strewn with carcasses of decaying fish. This is not a location in the geographic sense. It is an ontological event, a breach in the natural order through which deeper time becomes visible. Later stories, particularly The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, will mirror this device, using seismic activity as a trigger for suppressed realities to rise. Dagon also marks the first appearance of hybrid iconography. The monolith features carvings of grotesque fishes and aquatic humans, figures that return with greater narrative and theological weight in The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931. The glyphs here do not serve a magical or linguistic function. They are visual evidence of a continuity that defies historical time. Thectians, the narrator recalls, plainly visible on the surface of the block were the carven reliefs of a sort of aquatic anthropoid. There is no question of forgery or interpretation. The horror lies in the clarity of the evidence. These motifs, impossible architecture, ancient non-human art, dream-induced revelation, resurface in later stories, forming a kind of intertextual network. In The Nameless City, 1921, the narrator explores subterranean ruins adorned with alien murals. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, scientific explorers uncover a frozen city whose walls depict pre-human history. In each case, static images tell dynamic, destabilizing truths. The carvings in Dagon serve the same function. They collapse human history into a brief, irrelevant interlude. We must pause here to note that Dagon also foreshadows the unreliable archive, a critical mechanism in the mythos. The narrator's account is framed as a confession written under extreme psychological duress. He begins with a disavowal. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain. Like the narrators of The Call of Cthulhu and The Whisperer in Darkness, he records his experiences knowing they will be dismissed. This rhetorical posture becomes a hallmark of Lovecraftian narrative. The act of documentation functions not as revelation, but as a quarantine, a containment of corrosive knowledge. Although the name Dagon appears again in The Shadow over Innsmouth, there is no direct textual link confirming that the sea god worshipped by the Deep Ones is the same being described in the 1919 story. And yet, Lovecraft wants readers to make the connection. He builds his mythology not through formal consistency, but through resonance, echoes across stories that refuse to resolve into canon. This tactic mirrors religious traditions built on fragmentary scripture and oral myth, where continuity is intuited, not codified. The myth-building strategy at work here is cumulative, not linear. Dagon is not given a hierarchy, genealogy, or mythology in his first appearance. But his presence destabilizes the narrator's world so thoroughly that the reader suspects he is more than incidental. Lovecraft never returns to this specific character in detail, but later writers, August Derleth, Robert Bloch, Brian Lumley, will build on his presence, treating him as a key figure in the mythos pantheon. What begins as a one-off nightmare becomes a foundational archetype. Thus, Dagon serves two interconnected functions. First, it introduces a prototype for Lovecraftian horror: discovery without comprehension, contact without communication, exposure without resolution. Second, it initiates a cross-textual strategy in which meaning is not centralized, but dispersed. Dagon is not explained in any single story because he is not meant to be. He is part of a larger pattern that Lovecraft will weave incrementally, an architecture of implication, not exposition. This architecture finds fuller expression in later stories, especially The Shadow over Innsmouth, where Dagon's worship becomes systemic, generational, and intimately tied to human biology. The next subsection will examine this story in detail, tracing how Dagon's function evolves from a lone signifier of cosmic otherness into a symbol of civilizational rot and inherited transformation. Published in 1936, but written in 1931, The Shadow over Innsmouth represents the full maturation of the Dagon concept, no longer a fleeting, solitary presence, but a central figure in a complex system of myth, biology, and worship. If Dagon, 1919, is a glimpse into the abyss, Innsmouth is a guided descent. The story functions not as a sequel, but as an expansion, transforming the aquatic monolith and dream-wrought horror of the earlier work into a socio-biological structure that implicates not just individuals, but entire communities. Dagon here is no longer unnamed. He is referred to directly, not just as a figure of terror, but as the central deity of the esoteric order of Dagon, a secretive cult embedded in the decaying New England town of Innsmouth. Through the narrator's investigation, we learn that this cult originated when Captain Obed Marsh, a local sea trader, made contact with deep ones, amphibious beings who dwell in the depths and possess strange technologies and immortal lifespans. In exchange for gold and fish, Marsh permits interbreeding between his people and these oceanic entities. Dagon is described as the Father Dagon of the Deep Ones, often paired with Mother Hydra, though these names resist full theological explanation. Whether they are literal entities, symbolic figureheads, or something in between is never resolved. What's striking is the normalization of Dagon worship in Innsmouth. Unlike the isolated madness of the narrator in Dagon, here we encounter collective civic madness, a town structured around secrecy, decline, and biological metamorphosis. The horror is not in an ancient creature's sudden emergence, but in the slow, generational drift away from humanity. "There's gold everywhere, around here," one character says, "but no one dares touch it." The wealth acquired through communion with Dagon is simultaneously alluring and cursed. The price is not death, but inheritance. We must pause here to examine the mechanism of this horror. The central revelation, that the narrator himself is a descendant of the Deep Ones and is beginning to undergo the change, reframes the entire narrative. What had seemed like investigative journalism becomes a personal genealogical reckoning. This is not simply the discovery of external monstrosity, but ontological betrayal. The horror of Dagon in this story is not that he comes from outside, but that he is already inside. The triad is internalized: curiosity, ancestry, transformation. This narrative shift also recontextualizes the earlier 1919 story. There, the narrator's madness is sparked by an accidental glimpse. In Innsmouth, the protagonist goes seeking answers and finds something worse: belonging. The story ends not with death, but with acceptance. "I shall dwell with the marvels that my dreams have foreshadowed." Dagon's presence thus enables a radical thematic reversal. The narrator moves from alienation to alignment. Madness becomes metamorphosis. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's evolving view of the mythos. In earlier tales, madness was a wall. Once crossed, return was impossible. In Innsmouth, madness becomes a tunnel, leading somewhere ancient and aquatic, but coherent in its own logic. Dagon, as an emblem of this process, shifts from symbol of external threat to anchor of an alternate destiny. The esoteric order of Dagon offers not annihilation, but continuity. Horrifying, yes, but stable, even immortal. Intertextually, Innsmouth connects back to Dagon through imagery, oceanic temples, fish-human hybrids, narrative structure, first-person descent, and symbolic use of the sea. Yet where Dagon hints at isolation and cosmic irrelevance, Innsmouth embeds those same themes into race, heredity, and historical rot. The mythos expands through accretion, not retconning. Dagon does not evolve. Our understanding of his function does. This case study confirms Dagon's narrative utility, not as a god with teachings, but as a locus of convergence between land and sea, human and non-human, known and unknowable. In the next subsection, we examine a second major case study to explore how this convergence persists even when Dagon himself is absent, proving his function as an organizing absence in the mythos as much as a presence. Though Dagon is not named in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, his conceptual presence pervades the story. This absence is telling. Dagon, introduced explicitly in 1919 and expanded in The Shadow over Innsmouth, becomes, by 1928, an organizing absence. a conceptual ancestor whose imagery, themes, and ontological implications are absorbed into the broader mythos. In Cthulhu, Dagon's biological and cultic motifs reappear under a different name. Cthulhu emerges as the apex entity, but the deep-sea context, hybrid worship, and dream contagion all trace back to the earlier sea god figure. The plot structure of the Call of Cthulhu echoes Dagon in triadic form: scattered documentation, partial revelation, collapse of meaning. The narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, compiles newspaper clippings, personal notes, and sculptural analyses to reconstruct a series of seemingly disconnected events: dreams of vast aquatic cities, a mysterious cult in Louisiana, and the temporary surfacing of Relie, an alien city raised by an earthquake. This narrative scaffolding resembles Dagon's strategy, but where the earlier story isolates the narrator, Cthulhu embeds the crisis in networked knowledge. Madness spreads, not from solitary vision, but from global fragments. The Cthulhu cult itself resembles the esoteric order of Dagon, albeit on a planetary scale. The Louisiana branch worships Great Cthulhu, but their chants, Funglui Mglwunaf, Cthulhu Relie Wugach Nagel Vtagen, invoke concepts introduced in Dagon: submerged divinity, slumbering omnipotence, and eventual return. The cult's secrecy, racialized fear by outsiders, and grotesque rituals mirror those of Innsmouth. The difference lies in magnitude. Dagon is coastal, Cthulhu is planetary. Dagon represents biological regression. Cthulhu implies dimensional recursion and psychic collapse. We must pause here to consider the carved bas-relief in Cthulhu, described by Inspector Legrasse as a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. The sculpture depicts a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers. While the anatomy differs, the conceptual lineage to Dagon is clear: non-human sentience emerging from the sea, carved in stone, preserved by worshippers. The ancient artistry in Cthulhu performs the same epistemic function as the monolith in Dagon. It confirms what should not exist. A crucial difference emerges, however. In Dagon, the horror is initiated by a visual encounter and sealed by dreams. In Cthulhu, the dreams come first. Sensitive individuals across the globe experience nightmares of cyclopean architecture and rising tides. This inversion marks the maturation of Lovecraft's metaphysical framework. The mythos now precedes consciousness, leaking into minds before bodies are endangered. Dagon's influence is retroactively amplified. He no longer acts alone, but as one of many submerged entities affecting the surface world through conceptual contamination. Cthulhu's brief awakening mirrors Dagon's emergence in 1919. Both are tied to seismic shifts, earthquakes that raise buried cities or islands to the surface. Both cases, this surfacing is temporary. Cthulhu's rising is reversed, as is Dagon's monolithic island. This cyclical return suggests a cosmic ecology. The ocean periodically reveals truths the land is not ready to endure. The triad is reactivated: concealment, emergence, resubmergence. But with each cycle, more humans are touched. The system leaks. In this light, the Call of Cthulhu does not overwrite Dagon. It sublimates him. Dagon becomes a proof of concept, a submerged origin for the later proliferation of sea beings and psychic geographies. The cult of Dagon prefigures the cult of Cthulhu. The image of a sea being rising beside ancient carvings is replicated at higher ontological resolution. The horror expands, not linearly, but fractal-like, each iteration echoing earlier structures, but implying deeper systems. The story confirms that Dagon, while not mentioned, remains architecturally essential. He is the first ripple in a vast sea of implications. In the next section, we turn to how Lovecraft's collaborators and successors, especially August Derleth, attempted to formalize this architecture, often misunderstanding the philosophical instability that made Dagon's original role so disturbing. What follows is the story of systematization, taxonomy, and the unintended domestication of a primordial concept. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, the mythos did not remain static. It was expanded, restructured, and in many ways reinterpreted, primarily by members of what came to be known as the Lovecraft Circle, most notably August Derleth, who played a pivotal but controversial role in shaping the posthumous trajectory of Dagon and related entities. This phase of evolution is defined not by Lovecraft's philosophical rigor, but by a desire to organize and systematize the chaos he so carefully cultivated. Dagon, like many mythos figures, was drawn into this effort, his role reframed, his nature softened, and his thematic potency diluted. Derleth's central contribution was the development of a good versus evil framework, explicitly influenced by Judeo-Christian dualism. In his formulation, the mythos beings were divided into the elder gods, benevolent, and the great old ones, malevolent. Dagon was categorized as one of the latter, an evil entity aligned with elemental water. This alignment, while convenient for taxonomy, misunderstood Lovecraft's core insight, that cosmic entities are not evil, but indifferent. Dagon's horror arises precisely because he operates outside moral binaries. Derleth's schema reinstated the human-centric framework Lovecraft had meticulously dismantled. This distortion extended to Dagon's function. In Derleth's stories and mythos-adjacent fiction, Dagon often becomes a more demonic figure, participating in rituals, serving as a predictable cultic god, or being summoned for dark purposes. These portrayals tend to emphasize fear over epistemic collapse and occultism over ontology. The shift from awe to antagonism marks a thematic regression. Dagon no longer reveals the instability of human significance. He becomes an enemy to be feared or fought. Later writers adopted a range of approaches. Brian Lumley, in his Titus Crow series, 1970s-1980s, embraced Derleth's structure while injecting pulp adventure tropes. Dagon appears alongside a pantheon of other mythos entities, but functions more as a recognizable monster than an existential provocation. His depiction includes dramatic conflicts, magical technologies, and even coherent objectives. This transformation, Dagon as character rather than concept, indicates the extent to which mythos horror had, by the late 20th century, become compatible with mainstream fantasy. Not all expansions, however, were reductive. Some writers, particularly within experimental horror and weird fiction, resisted systematization. Thomas Ligotti and Laird Barron draw from Lovecraft's conceptual lineage without relying on specific entities. In this tradition, Dagon becomes non-localized, a name whispered, a recurring form, a symbol of abyssal continuity rather than a discrete god. These allusions restore something of Lovecraft's original ambiguity, treating Dagon as a philosophical placeholder for what remains unassimilated in the human worldview. Role-playing games, particularly Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu, 1981 to present, also contributed significantly to Dagon's visibility. In these systems, Dagon is codified. He has stats, cult behaviors, spells, and relationships. While this enables structured gameplay, it also finalizes what Lovecraft left deliberately open. Dagon becomes mechanically knowable, even defeatable, an outcome fundamentally at odds with his literary origins. And yet, this gamification introduced new generations to the mythos, ensuring its cultural persistence. We must pause here to reflect on the implications. Systematizing Dagon satisfies a need for narrative order, but it also blunts his philosophical edge. Lovecraft's Dagon is terrifying because he is not reducible, not a villain, not a deity, not a monster in any conventional sense. He interrupts narrative logic. Later iterations, even when richly imagined, tend to fold him back into that logic. The horror shifts from cognitive collapse to external threat, from ontological to tactical. Nevertheless, these expansions confirm Dagon's centrality. He persists not because of definitional clarity, but because of conceptual stickiness. Whether a god, symbol, monster, or evolutionary endpoint, he marks the place where biological familiarity erodes into mythic uncertainty. Each retelling, however distorted, reaffirms his role as a carrier of submerged knowledge, knowledge that undermines its possessor. He becomes less a character than an ideational vector, transmitting Lovecraft's core insight, that some truths do not destroy us because they are false, but because they are true in a way we cannot integrate. In the next section, we follow that vector into the world beyond fiction, where Dagon surfaces not in manuscripts, but in myths, sightings, adaptations, and subcultural echoes. The literary phase ends, and the psychological afterlife begins. Despite originating as a fictional invention, Dagon has bled into the margins of modern folklore and urban legend, where the boundaries between narrative, delusion, and cultural transmission blur. This phenomenon is not unique to Dagon. The mythos as a whole has long flirted with pseudo-reality. But what makes Dagon particularly persistent in mythic echoes is his plausible habitat. Unlike extra-dimensional beings or frozen Antarctic races, Dagon resides in the deep ocean, a space already imbued with human unease, historical uncertainty, and biological opacity. He doesn't need to be believed in to function like a myth. Modern sightings of sea monsters continue with remarkable frequency, often uncannily mirroring the imagery introduced in Lovecraft's fiction. Humanoid aquatic forms, massive scaled limbs breaching the water, glowing eyes in coastal caves. In 2004, a viral thread on early internet forums described a deep-sea diving incident off the Mariana Trench, where a diver allegedly saw a statue with humanoid eyes still open beneath the coral. While quickly dismissed as fiction, the story spread widely, cited in online Dagon forums as possible proof. These stories function less as belief systems and more as participatory folklore. Open-source myth-making in digital space. We must pause here to acknowledge that Lovecraft's mythos was designed to imitate folklore. His stories often use layered documents, references to non-existent texts, and first-person testimonials to generate a tone of authenticity. Dagon, with its suicidal narrator and clinical prose, reads less like a short story and more like a recovered psychiatric case file. This structure primes readers to interpret the tale as a suppressed truth. As one Reddit user commented under a recent discussion thread, "It's creepier because it feels like something someone wrote the night before they vanished." This structure bleeds easily into hoaxes. In 2012, a YouTube video claiming to show a deep one surfacing near an oil rig amassed over 4 million views before being debunked as edited footage from a Greenpeace campaign. The hoax succeeded not because of its realism, but because it tapped into an existing mythos. The visuals, glimpsed fins, rhythmic chanting, deep guttural noises, mimicked what readers had internalized from Lovecraft's fiction. The hoax was not an act of deception, but an act of ritual repetition. It confirmed what audiences already wanted to feel, that the sea hides something. Dagon's reappearance in dream accounts further blurs the lines. On forums like R No Sleep and 4chan's X, users report recurring aquatic dreams with remarkable consistency. Underwater cities, echoing, chants, eyes beneath the surface. These reports are rarely believed, but belief is beside the point. What matters is recurrence. The myth reproduces itself not through factual claims, but through patterned motifs. The sea becomes a collective unconscious, and Dagon, a recurring dream symbol, manifests as archetype rather than apparition. Why does this persist? Because Dagon satisfies several deep cultural needs simultaneously. First, he personifies the unknown in a context we cannot exhaust, the ocean. Over 80% of the sea remains unmapped. This factual gap becomes a narrative opportunity. Second, he inhabits a zone where science and myth overlap. Ancient gods of the sea, modern deep-sea biology, and speculative horror all share a common palette: pressure, darkness, longevity, fluidity. Finally, Dagon offers a story not of invasion, but of displacement. He was here before us, and he will remain after. This positions Dagon not just as a mythological figure, but as a cultural placeholder, an entity invoked when the sea resists understanding, when boundaries between natural and supernatural blur. Whether referenced in prank videos, recurring dreams, or digitally circulated lore, Dagon acts as a signal, not of truth, but of insufficient explanation. Something is there, and language has not yet caught up. In the next section, we explore how this signal has been taken up by creative industries, cinema, games, and music, which amplify and reframe Dagon for new audiences. There, the question is no longer whether he is believed, but how he is performed. Dagon's afterlife in visual and interactive media reveals both the endurance and the distortion of his original meaning. As he moves from literature into film, games, and music, Dagon becomes increasingly visible, but also increasingly defined. This visibility comes at a cost. What was once a symbol of scale, indifference, and ontological uncertainty becomes, in many adaptations, a recognizable antagonist. And yet, these portrayals still participate in a broader cultural effort to gesture toward the inexpressible, a goal consistent with Lovecraft's original intent, even when the form diverges. The most direct cinematic adaptation is Dagon, 2001, directed by Stuart Gordon. Loosely combining elements of Dagon, 1919, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, in 1936, the film transposes the setting to a Spanish fishing village named Imboca. Here, Dagon is depicted more overtly as a god figure demanding sacrifice, with monstrous hybrids worshipping him through ritual and violence. The film emphasizes body horror and cultic zealotry, foregrounding themes of miscegenation and inherited transformation. While the atmospheric decay of the town recalls Lovecraft's work, the film simplifies the metaphysical ambiguity. Dagon becomes a creature to be escaped, not an idea to be endured. In video games, Dagon's presence is diffuse but influential. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, Chaosium, 1981, established a mechanical template for his appearances. In its digital descendants, such as Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, and The Sinking City, 2019, Dagon or his cult often appears as part of a submerged threat, tied to psychic corruption and urban rot. These games reproduce key motifs: flooded cities, distorted fish-like humans, and rituals beneath the surface. The mechanics of sanity loss, central to Lovecraftian horror gaming, implicitly reinforce Dagon's original function, not as a killer, but as a cognitive destabilizer. We must pause here to consider why Dagon thrives in interactive media. Games simulate exploration, descent, and revelation, narrative modes central to mythos horror. They allow players to touch the edges of the unknowable without resolving it. In Bloodborne 2015, while never naming Dagon directly, the game's aquatic monsters, deep-sea god forms, and themes of transformation through forbidden knowledge mirror his conceptual role. These echoes are not accidental. Lovecraft's influence is explicit in design commentary, and Dagon functions as one of several deep templates for horror that emerges not from violence, but from evolutionary horror and epistemic drift. In music, Dagon-inspired themes appear most vividly in doom metal and dark ambient genres. Bands like The Great Old Ones and Sun O compose pieces evoking abyssal pressure, cyclic emergence, and drowned architectures. Dagon appears not in lyrics, but in sonic structure. Repetitive, low-frequency motifs mimic tidal motion and invoke a sense of submerged weight. These soundscapes act as atmospheres rather than narratives, echoing Lovecraft's prose, where tone precedes event and meaning remains submerged. Ambient composer Lustmord's The Place Where the Black Stars Hang, 1994, though not explicitly about Dagon, channels similar oceanic dread. Dagon's persistence across these media forms suggests his function has shifted from deity to modular, archetype. He can be inserted into systems of gameplay, visual horror, or sonic dread because his essence is not doctrinal but symbolic. He stands for the threat of return, the breakdown of coastal boundaries, and the unsettling idea that evolution is not finished. Whether represented as a massive god form, a corrupted town's patron, or a tidal rhythm, Dagon persists because he is structurally adaptable. This adaptability speaks to a deeper truth. Dagon is not merely an entity. He is a pattern, a narrative shape, descent, contact, mutation, water, ritual, collapse. In adapting him, creators are not translating a character. They are participating in a ritual of recurrence. Every film, game, or track that invokes him adds another layer of sediment to a mythology that is meant to feel ancient, cumulative, and unresolved. In the next section, we turn from cultural production to cultural adoption. How has Dagon moved from fiction and media into the language of subcultures, academic, theory, and even ideological frameworks? What does it mean that a fictional sea god now serves as a shorthand for everything we cannot contain? Dagon's endurance does not rely solely on fiction or media. Over the last 4 decades, he has been adopted, reconfigured, and repurposed across a spectrum of subcultural movements and academic discourses, where the distinction between horror and theory becomes porous. While the figure of Dagon originated as a literary symbol of unknowability, he now circulates as a kind of conceptual shorthand, used to articulate anxieties around history, ecology, identity, and collapse. This shift reveals how Lovecraftian horror has moved from the bookshelf into ontological vocabulary. Within online subcultures, particularly on forums like Reddit's r/r Lovecraft, 4chan's r/x, and various occult-tinged Discord servers, Dagon is not simply discussed, he is invoked. Memes portraying Dagon as a baptizer in abyssal truth coexist with ironic prayers and digital rituals where users jokingly, or half-jokingly, ask for the blessings of the deep. These expressions often begin as parody, but evolve into ritualized performance, not unlike chaos magic's postmodern bricolage. Dagon is not worshipped in the theological sense, but he functions as a totem of anti-modern sensibility, pre-rational, anti-anthropocentric, and deeply ambivalent. Parallel to this, academic theory, particularly within speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, has absorbed Lovecraftian tropes to confront philosophical challenges. Scholars such as Graham Harman and Eugene Thacker have drawn directly from the mythos to articulate ideas about inaccessible objects and the limits of human thought. Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, writes of the unhuman, a zone of reality indifferent to human values or comprehension. Dagon, while not named, fits this framework precisely, not a god to be understood, but a presence that nullifies understanding. We must pause here to consider the appeal. Subcultural and academic appropriations both thrive on estrangement. The sense that the dominant worldview is incomplete or illusory. Dagon offers a mythic language for expressing this estrangement without resolving it. In digital culture, where irony and sincerity often coalesce, Dagon is simultaneously a joke, a mood, and a metaphor. In critical theory, he is a floating signifier for that which exceeds the anthropocentric frame. In both realms, he performs the same function, naming the unnaming. The esoteric order of Dagon has also been adopted into various roleplay and cosplay communities, particularly within live-action role-playing, LARP, and alt-religious performance spaces. These appropriations blend horror with aesthetic rebellion. Black robes, fish-scale textures, and aquatic chants are used not to reenact Lovecraft's fiction literally, but to stage opposition to normative order. Dagon becomes a symbol of submerged knowledge, what society represses, what the surface narrative omits. Importantly, these reappropriations often detach Dagon from Lovecraft's own views, especially his xenophobic and racist subtext. Many subcultures explicitly invert these associations, using Dagon as a symbol of hybridity, fluid identity, and posthuman liberation. In queer horror circles, Dagon becomes a metaphor for bodies that defy binary classification, neither fully human nor fully other. In eco-Gothic discourse, he is invoked as a figure of oceanic revenge, the sea's response to anthropocentric exploitation. This transformation, from horror icon to fluid symbol, raises the question, what remains of Dagon when his original meaning is submerged beneath reinterpretation? The answer may be structural rather than doctrinal. Dagon persists not because his mythology is fixed, but because his form is modular. He can be worshipped ironically, cited academically, invoked performatively. His very ambiguity, God, monster, ancestor, symbol, ensures his survival. In the final subsection, we turn inward to ask why Dagon's psychological architecture continues to resonate. Beyond media and subculture, what does his figure reveal about the human desire to imagine, externalize, and confront that which we can neither control nor name? Dagon endures not because he offers answers, but because he embodies a question that cannot be resolved. What happens when the human mind encounters a reality in which it has no privileged place? In Lovecraft's fiction, and in the cultural afterlife that followed, Dagon is not merely a figure of horror. He is an intellectual catalyst, a provocation that destabilizes the systems we use to understand ourselves. His true terror lies not in destruction, but in continuation. He is always there, always watching, always beneath. Civilization is temporary. The sea is not. Psychologically, Dagon reveals a deep contradiction in the human mind. We crave narrative closure, moral frameworks, and stable identities. Yet we live in a cosmos defined by scale, indifference, and flux. Dagon occupies the intersection of these irreconcilable needs. He is monstrous because he is familiar. The fish-human hybrid is not wholly alien. It is too close, too plausible, too reminiscent of evolutionary possibility. He speaks to a dread that biology is not destiny, but drift, not the image of God, but the residue of the ocean floor. This is where Dagon differs from traditional demons or gods. He does not offer punishment for sin, nor transcendence from suffering. Instead, he removes the frame. The moral, spiritual, and scientific categories through which humans interpret the world become meaningless in his presence. In philosophical terms, Dagon forces an encounter with the non-anthropocentric real, what Slavoj Žižek or Eugene Thacker might call the world without us. The human subject becomes noise. Madness is not a breakdown, but a rational response to misalignment. We must pause here to consider the implications of that shift. If Dagon symbolizes what lies beyond human meaning, then to speak of what he wants from modern civilization is itself a kind of category error. Dagon does not want, he exists. Yet this absence of intent creates space for projection. He becomes a screen for modern anxieties, climate collapse, evolutionary redundancy, post-human drift. In this light, Dagon is not warning us of some external catastrophe. He is revealing that the catastrophe has already occurred in the form of misplaced assumptions about our centrality. This may explain his symbolic persistence in an era defined by ecological crisis. Rising seas, species collapse, and the return of ancient pathogens all resonate with Lovecraft's vision of buried things resurfacing. The drowned city of R'lyeh, the deep ones, the emergence of Dagon, all reflect a planetary unconscious in which the sea is both womb and grave. In a world where the ice melts and the tides rise, Dagon ceases to be a monster and becomes a medium, the shape the Anthropocene gives to its unease. In therapeutic terms, Dagon might be read as a mirror for unintegrated knowledge, truths that the conscious mind cannot accept without fracturing. His mythology contains no solutions, only exposure. There is no way to defeat Dagon. There is only contact, awareness, and eventual collapse. Or, in some cases, transformation. The shadow over Innsmouth ends not in death, but in assimilation. The narrator does not die. He adapts. He becomes. This final ambiguity, does survival mean mutation, is one of the most haunting implications of the mythos. And so Dagon remains, not as a creature to be believed in, but as an idea that cannot be unwound. He does not require cults or rituals to function. Attention alone is sufficient. Every reading, adaptation, joke, or invocation adds to his density. His power lies in being suggestive, cumulative, irreversible. He is a symbol of what has always been waiting, just out of sight, below the threshold of the comprehensible. Not X, but Y. Not the end of the world, but the end of our idea of it. The investigation ends here, but the presence does not. Dagon submerges, not vanishes. The ocean closes, but the mind remains marked. And in the quiet, a new awareness persists. We are not alone, not in the theological sense, but in the evolutionary one. The sea remembers, and some things do not need to rise to be real.